Before the Navy's SEALs, before Delta Force, before America even had a name for special forces, there was a unit so secret, so unconventional, that even the US military wasn't sure it should exist. In 1942, as the Pacific burned and America reeled from Pearl Harbor, a quiet experiment began inside the United States Marine Corps. It wasn't announced to the public. It wasn't celebrated in newspapers. And for years, it was barely mentioned in official histories. These men were not trained to fight fair. They were trained to strike first, strike hard, and disappear. They carried no glory with them, only risk. While thousands of Marines prepared for massive beach invasions, this small group was being taught something entirely different. How to land silently at night. How to survive alone in hostile jungle. How to attack enemy positions from directions no one expected. They would operate behind enemy lines, cut off from reinforcements, often with no clear extraction plan. And if something went wrong, there would be no rescue. Most Americans have never heard their name. Yet their mission shaped the future of modern warfare. They were America's first special forces. They were called the Marine Raiders, and their story begins not with victory, but with fear. Fear inside the US military itself. Because in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, America faced a terrifying reality. It was fighting a war it didn't know how to win. The Japanese weren't just defending islands. They were turning jungles into fortresses. They were masters of ambush, deception, and night combat. Traditional tactics were failing. And deep inside the Marine Corps, a dangerous question began to surface. What if the old way of fighting wasn't enough anymore? That question would give birth to a force unlike anything America had ever created. A force that would change warfare forever and then, just as quietly, disappear. The shock of Pearl Harbor didn't just cripple the US Pacific Fleet. It shattered confidence overnight. America realized it was facing an enemy that fought differently, an enemy that moved silently through jungles, struck without warning, and vanished before conventional forces could respond. In the early months of 1942, US Marines were being trained for large-scale amphibious assault mass landings supported by overwhelming firepower. But the Pacific War wasn't following the rulebook. The islands weren't open beaches. They were tangled jungles, steep ridges, and narrow coastlines controlled by an enemy that knew the terrain far better than any invading force ever could. Japanese units specialized in infiltration. They attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, and used the darkness as a weapon. American commanders began receiving reports that sounded almost unbelievable. Enemy soldiers appearing from nowhere, striking hard and melting back into the jungle. Before dawn, traditional Marine units weren't built for this kind of war. At the same time, US intelligence was watching the British closely. In Europe and North Africa, small, highly trained British commando units were conducting raids behind enemy lines, destroying infrastructure, gathering intelligence, and sowing fear far beyond their actual numbers. President Franklin D. Roosevelt took notice. Roosevelt believed that America needed its own version of these commandos, but adapted for the Pacific. He wanted a force that could strike Japanese positions long before major invasions began. A unit capable of reconnaissance, sabotage, and shock assaults in terrain where large formations struggle to survive. Inside the Marine Corps, this idea was controversial. Many senior officers believed elite units undermined discipline and unity. They feared creating special Marines would weaken the rest of the force. Others worried such units would suffer catastrophic losses in isolated operations. But the battlefield didn't wait for consensus. As American casualties mounted and victories remained elusive, the demand for a new solution grew louder. The war was exposing the limits of conventional thinking, and the Marine Corps stood at a crossroads. Either adapt or continue paying the price in blood. Out of that tension between tradition and necessity, the Marine Raiders were born, not as heroes, not as legends, but as an experiment few believed would survive. And two men would shape that experiment in dramatically different ways. The Marine Raiders did not emerge from a single plan or a unified vision. They were born out of urgency, disagreement, and to very different philosophies of war embodied by two Marine officers who would shape the future of American special operations. The first was Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, a disciplined, hard-edged Marine with years of combat experience. Edson believed in strict structure, aggressive leadership, and relentless training. To him, elite troops were not rebels or lone wolves. They were Marines pushed to the highest possible standard. The second was Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carson, a man whose ideas unsettled the traditional Marine hierarchy. Carson had served in China, where he studied guerrilla warfare up close. He believed modern war required flexibility, equality between officers and enlisted men, and deep trust built through shared hardship. His philosophy was radical for its time. When President Roosevelt authorized the creation of American commando-style units in early 1942, both men were given a chance to prove their ideas. Two Raider battalions were formed. Edson would command the 1st Marine Raider Battalion. Carson would lead the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. From the beginning, the Raiders were different. They trained separately. They wore modified uniforms. They were issued unconventional weapons. And they were told very clearly that their missions would not come with backup or forgiveness for failure. Carson pushed his men through intense physical conditioning and long-distance marches. He emphasized initiative over rank and encouraged every raider to think like a leader. Edson demanded precision, discipline, and absolute combat readiness. To many senior officers, the Raiders felt like an experiment spinning out of control. Critics questioned their value. Some openly mocked the idea of elite Marines. Others worried the Raiders would become undisciplined or reckless. But the war was accelerating, and the Pacific needed results. The Raiders were about to be tested not in training, but in real combat, deep in enemy territory, a mission so risky it would define the unit's reputation overnight and prove whether this bold experiment had been a mistake or a breakthrough. Becoming a Marine Raider was not about earning a badge or a title. It was about survival. The training was designed with one goal in mind: to strip men down to their limits and see who could still function when everything familiar was taken away from the first day. Raiders were pushed beyond the standards of regular Marine units. Physical exhaustion was constant. Long-distance runs were followed by obstacle courses. Then hours of combat drills with no recovery time in between. Sleep was treated as a luxury, not a right. But physical strength alone wasn't enough. Raiders were trained to operate independently. In small teams, often with no clear chain of command, they learned jungle navigation, silent movement, night fighting, and ambush tactics. Every man was expected to understand not just his role, but the mission as a whole. Carlson's battalion adopted unconventional methods. Officers and enlisted men trained side by side. Decisions were discussed openly. Trust was built through shared suffering. This approach shocked traditional Marine leadership, but it forged units that could adapt under pressure. Edson's Raiders, by contrast, trained with ruthless precision. Drills were repeated until mistakes vanished. Live-fire exercises pushed men to trust each other completely. Any weakness was exposed and corrected or eliminated. One of the most brutal elements was amphibious training. Raiders practiced landing from rubber boats in total darkness, navigating rough surf, and silently assembling on hostile shores. Mistakes could mean drowning. There were no second chances. Many volunteers quit. Others were injured before they ever saw combat. Those who remained learned an uncomfortable truth. Raiders were not trained to hold ground. They were trained to strike, disrupt, and disappear, often before the enemy even realized they were under attack. By the time training ended, the Raiders were no longer ordinary Marines. They were something new, and the war was about to demand proof that this suffering had meaning. Their first mission would send them deep into enemy territory with no guarantee of extraction. In August of 1942, the Marine Raiders were given a mission that would test everything they had trained for. The target was Makin Island, a small Japanese-held outpost deep in the Gilbert Islands. On paper, it looked insignificant. In reality, it was a proving ground. The plan was bold and dangerous. Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion would be transported by submarine and insertion method. Almost unheard of for U.S. The Raiders moved through palm groves and narrow trails, engaging Japanese forces in close quarters. The fighting was chaotic. Visibility was poor. Communication between units was limited. Despite this, the Raiders pressed forward, using speed and aggression to overwhelm enemy positions. They succeeded in their objectives. Japanese installations were destroyed. Enemy troops were killed or scattered. Intelligence was collected. But the cost was high. Extraction turned into chaos. Some raiders were left behind in the confusion, unable to reach the submarines in time. Those men were later captured and executed by Japanese forces, a tragedy that would haunt the raiders and raise serious questions about the operation's planning. The raid shocked both sides. For the Japanese, it proved American forces could strike deep behind the lines. For the U.S. military, it revealed both the potential and the dangers of unconventional warfare. The Marine Raiders had proven they could fight, but they had also proven how thin the margin for error truly was. And as the war escalated, the Raiders were about to face a far more brutal test, one that would define their place in history. a test that would unfold in the jungles of Guadalcanal. By the time the Marine Raiders arrived on Guadalcanal, the island had already earned a reputation for brutality. The jungle was thick, the heat relentless, and the enemy determined to retake the island at any cost. What began as an amphibious invasion had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The raiders were thrown into the most dangerous terrain. On the island, their mission was not to hold beaches or advance in large formations. They were assigned to patrol deep jungle ridges, disrupt Japanese movements, and plug gaps where conventional units were stretched thin. This placed them directly in the path of some of the fiercest fighting of the entire campaign. The defining moment came in September 1942. Japanese forces launched a massive nighttime assault aimed at breaking through American lines and driving straight to Henderson Field, the heart of U.S. air power on the island. If Henderson fell, Guadalcanal would fall with it. At a narrow jungle ridge later known as Edson's Ridge, Merritt Edson's raiders found themselves facing overwhelming numbers. The Japanese attacked in waves, screaming as they charged through darkness and gunfire. The fighting collapsed into hand-to-hand combat. Grenades exploded at close range. Positions were lost, then retaken. Sometimes multiple times in the same night. The raiders were exhausted, outnumbered, and nearly surrounded. But they held, through sheer discipline and aggressive counterattacks. Edson's men prevented a breakthrough that could have changed the entire Pacific War. By dawn, the ridge was littered with casualties. The raiders had suffered heavy losses, but they had stopped the Japanese advance. The battle earned Edson the Medal of Honor and cemented the raiders' reputation as elite fighters. Yet the cost was enormous. The jungle took its toll. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion spread through the unit. Replacement troops were scarce. Every raider lost was irreplaceable. Guadalcanal proved the raiders' value beyond any doubt. But it also exposed a hard truth. Elite units could not be used endlessly without breaking. And the war was far from over. In late 1942, while Guadalcanal still raged, Evans Carlson launched one of the most audacious missions in U.S. military history, a deep penetration patrol that would push the Marine Raiders to the edge of collapse. Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion was ordered to move behind Japanese lines and disrupt enemy forces over a vast stretch of jungle terrain. This was not a quick strike. It was a sustained operation with no fixed front, no secure supply lines, and no guarantee of relief. For 30 days, the raiders lived in the jungle. They marched through knee-deep mud and dense vegetation, often moving. At night, to avoid detection, food ran low. Medical supplies were scarce. Malaria, jungle rot, and dysentery spread rapidly. Men grew weak, but the patrol kept moving. Japanese forces hunted them relentlessly. Skirmishes erupted without warning. Raiders ambushed enemy patrols, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Carlson's men relied on speed, deception, and psychological pressure, striking where least expected, then slipping back into the jungle. Leadership was constantly tested. Carlson's philosophy of shared responsibility became critical. When officers fell ill or were wounded, enlisted men stepped forward without hesitation. Decisions were made collectively. based on survival rather than rank. At times, the battalion was on the verge of destruction. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Others were carried on improvised stretchers for miles. Yet the patrol continued, harassing Japanese forces and disrupting their movements far beyond what anyone thought possible. When the raiders finally emerged from the jungle, they were barely recognizable, physically broken, severely under strength, but alive. Carlson's long patrol became legendary not because of territory gained, but because of what it proved. Small, elite units could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods, inflicting damage far out of proportion to their numbers. But the mission also exposed the limits of such warfare. The raiders had succeeded, but at a cost that raised difficult questions. How long could men be pushed like this? And how many times? Those questions would soon turn inward, as pressure began mounting not from the enemy, but from within the Marine Corps itself. By late 1943, the Marine Raiders had proven themselves repeatedly. In combat, they had raided enemy territory, held critical ground, and survived missions few conventional units could endure. Yet their greatest threat was no longer the Japanese, it was the growing resistance. Within their own ranks, the raiders had become symbols of innovation, and that made them dangerous in a military institution built on tradition. Many senior Marine officers believed the raiders disrupted unity. They worried that creating elite units suggested regular Marines were somehow less capable. Others resented the attention the raiders received, especially as their commanders were praised in the press and awarded high honors. There was also a deeper doctrinal conflict. The Marine Corps was preparing for massive amphibious assaults operations. That required large, disciplined formations supported by overwhelming firepower. The raiders, by contrast, were built for small unit warfare, stealth, and independence. Their methods didn't align neatly with the direction the Corps believed the war was heading. Carlson's leadership style drew particular criticism. His emphasis on equality between ranks and shared decision-making challenged long-standing hierarchies. Some officers viewed his battalion as undisciplined. Despite its battlefield success, even Edson, widely respected and highly decorated, could not fully shield the raiders from skepticism. As casualties mounted and manpower shortages worsened, questions grew louder. Why maintain elite units that required extensive training when the war demanded mass forces? Why invest in specialized tactics when large-scale invasions were becoming the priority? Behind closed doors, decisions were being made. The raiders were still fighting the enemy, but their fate was already being debated in staff meetings and headquarters far from the front lines. And the outcome of those debates would surprise nearly everyone who had fought alongside them. By 1944, the Marine Raiders faced a harsh reality. Success on the battlefield did not guarantee survival. As a unit, despite their proven effectiveness, the very qualities that made them elite independence, small unit tactics, and unconventional methods had made them a target within the Marine Corps hierarchy. The strategic landscape had shifted. Large-scale amphibious operations now dominated the Pacific. The Corps needed standardized forces capable of taking and holding islands in coordinated assaults. Specialized raider units, operating independently, no longer fit neatly into the operational plan. Political and bureaucratic pressures intensified. Senior commanders argued that maintaining separate, elite battalions was inefficient. Training resources, manpower, and equipment could be better used elsewhere. Officers who had questioned the raiders' methods finally won their point. Elite forces were a luxury in a war demanding mass mobilization. In early 1944, the decision was made. The Marine Raiders would be disbanded. Their men were absorbed into conventional Marine units or reassigned to other elite programs. Subtle victories in the jungle would be overshadowed by large-scale campaigns in the islands. Yet, the disbandment was bittersweet. Many raiders felt betrayed. They had survived the impossible, endured extreme hardship, and pioneered tactics that would save countless lives. And yet, their contributions were quietly folded into the larger machinery of war, almost erased from history. Still, the legacy of the raiders was far from gone. Their training methods, jungle tactics, and small unit strategies became the foundation for future American Special Operations Forces. Techniques first tested on Mackinac Island and Guadalcanal would later influence the creation of Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and Army Rangers. In the end, the Raiders had won the war in ways most people would never fully see. They had shown what could be accomplished by a small group of highly trained, highly motivated men. And though the battalions were gone, their spirit would live on. Though the Marine Raiders were disbanded in 1944, their influence on American military operations was profound and enduring. The lessons learned from their raids, patrols, and jungle warfare became the blueprint for future elite units. Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and even Army Rangers inherited the Raiders' principles. Small, highly trained teams operating behind enemy lines, relying on stealth, speed, and ingenuity. The ethos of the Raider, adaptable, fearless, and self-reliant, remains central to modern special operations. But the Raiders' story is more than tactics and strategy. It's a human story. These men endured unimaginable conditions, facing disease, starvation, enemy fire, and the constant threat of death. They pushed beyond what conventional soldiers were expected to survive, and in doing so, redefined courage in warfare. For decades, their story was largely forgotten. The military history books focused on large-scale battles and amphibious campaigns, while the Raiders' daring raids remained footnotes almost erased from memory. Only in recent years have historians' and veterans' accounts begun to shine light on their contributions. Their legacy is a reminder of the power of innovation, the importance of adaptability, and the sacrifices of those who operate in the shadows. The Marine Raiders were America's first experiment in special operations, and though their battalions were short-lived, their impact was permanent. The men who survived carried forward the Raider spirit, and generations of elite soldiers that followed continue to honor it. From the jungles of the Pacific to modern battlefields around the world, the Raiders' influence echoes loudly. They were the men who dared to do the impossible. They were the first of America's special forces, and their story is one of bravery, ingenuity, and legacy a story that must never be forgotten.